Welcome to Part 7 of The Wine Merchant. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 19. Inspector Trammell had spent a considerable amount of time away from London investigating the case, but he had not lost track of Madeleine, Slatin, and Bostick. He knew that the girl was still staying with her aunt in Eastbourne, and the local police, who provided him with updates, believed that her youth and vitality were coming back to her as she quickly recovered from the shock of her father's tragic death. Bostick was constantly in town. He practically lived at the George, commuting daily to his office and spending as many evenings and Sundays with Mrs. Luttrell as he could. Despite his efforts, the young man felt that his hopes were further away than ever. Madeleine had made it clear that she wouldn't marry him until the mystery of her father's murder was solved, and the guilty were brought to justice. He grew increasingly worried that she meant what she said. He pleaded with her to think of the living rather than the dead, urging her not to ruin both their lives over what was, in the end, just sentiment. While she listened to his pleas and remained kind and gentle, her resolve was unwavering. Feeling he had no choice, Bostick decided to stay as close as possible to her, hoping that over time she would grow used to his presence and perhaps come to rely on it. Given these circumstances, his anxiety about the case's progress was immense, and he had written to Trammell several times, asking for updates on the investigation. However, the inspector remained tight-lipped, leaving Bostick in the dock about the situation. It was with a sense of eager anticipation that he answered a call from Trammell at Scotland Yard. "I just returned from Bordeaux," the inspector said. "I need to discuss some important matters with Miss Slatin. I would appreciate your presence as well, if possible. Can you arrange for us to meet?" "Do you want her to come to London?" "Not necessarily. I can go to Eastbourne if it's easier. But we need to keep this meeting strictly confidential. The syndicate must not find out." Bostick felt a surge of excitement and hope. "Let's go to Eastbourne then," he suggested. "I can take you down tonight on the 5:20 from Victoria." "No," Trammell replied. "We can't risk being seen together. Let's meet at the corner of Grand Parade and Carlisle Road at 9 o'clock. Once they agreed, both men set about making arrangements. Bostick quickly wrapped up his work at the office and caught the first train to Eastbourne. By 5 o'clock, he was at Mrs. Luttrell's door asking for Miss Slatin. "Dear Madeleine," he said after sharing his news, "don't get your hopes up. This may amount to nothing. Don't build any expectations." But soon he had her just as excited as he was. He stayed for dinner, leaving shortly before 9 to keep his appointment with Trammell. The plan was for both men to return to the house, where Madeleine would meet them alone. Inspector Trammell, however, did not take Bostick's train. Instead, he caught the 5:35 to Brighton, had dinner there, and then slipped out of the hotel to drive over to Eastbourne. After dismissing his vehicle at the Grand Hotel, he strolled down the parade and met Bostick at their agreed spot. In 10 minutes, they were in Mrs. Luttrell's drawing room. "I apologize for intruding, Miss Slatin," Trammell began politely, "but I need your assistance, and indirectly Mr. Bostick's as well. However, I think it's only fair to first bring you up to speed on what has transpired since our last meeting. I must warn you, though, that what I'm about to say must remain strictly confidential. Not a word of this should leave your lips." "I promise," Bostick replied without hesitation. "And I do too," Madeleine added. "I didn't need that assurance," Trammell continued. "It's enough that you grasp the seriousness of the situation. After the inquest, I got to work." He recounted briefly his investigations in London and Hull, his findings at Selden, the evidence linking Archer as the actual murderer, the details of the smuggling ring, and finally, his suspicions that the other members of the syndicate were aware of Mr. Slatin's death, along with his inability to prove it. His two listeners paid keen attention, their interest in his story mixed with admiration for his accomplishments. "So Gibbons was right about the brandy after all," Bostick exclaimed. "He deserves some credit for that. I think he believed it all along, despite our conclusion that it was impossible. Goodness, how easily we can be fooled. Trammell turned his gaze to him. "Don't feel disappointed about your role in this, sir," he advised. "I believe you and Mr. Gibbons did remarkably well. I'll tell you, I thought so highly of your work that I verified none of your findings." Bostick felt warmth rise to his cheeks in pleasure. "That's very kind of you to say, Inspector," he said, "but I'm afraid most of the credit goes to Gibbons." "I was referring to your joint efforts," Trammell insisted. "Now, let's get to the matter at hand. As I mentioned, my challenge is that I suspect the members of the syndicate are involved in Mr. Slatton's death, but I lack proof. I've devised a plan that may help us uncover this evidence. I need your assistance." "Mr. Inspector," Madeleine interjected reproachfully, "do you even need to ask?" Trammell laughed. "But I can't just walk in and demand it, you know." "Of course you can," Madeleine replied. "You know that Mr. Bostick and I would do anything for this cause." "I believe you, and I'm going to put you to the test. Here's my idea. What if they hold one of their private meetings to discuss syndicate matters, and we manage to have witnesses present to overhear their conversation? There's a real chance they might incriminate themselves." "Yes," Bostick said, clearly intrigued. "That could work, but I'm not sure how you set that up." Trammell smiled faintly. "I think we could make it happen," he said. "If a meeting were to be scheduled, we could find out where it's taking place and listen in. But the first hurdle is getting them to hold a meeting. Typically, they might not meet for months, so we need to create a reason for one. And that," he turned to Madeleine, "is where I need your help." His audience looked puzzled, and Trammell continued. "There needs to be something significant that will prompt the leaders to call a full conference of the members. From what I can see, you are the only one who can make that happen. I'll explain how, but I must warn you that it may stir up some painful memories." Madeleine listened intently, her lips slightly parted. "Go on," she urged. "We've already talked about that." "Thank you," Trammell responded, pulling out a sheet of paper from his pocket. "I have a draft of a letter that I want you to write to Captain Beamish. You can word it however you want. I actually prefer it in your own style. Read this, and you'll see what I mean." The draft read: SILVRDA Road. ESDBO Warrany. Dear Captain Beamish, while sorting through some papers that belonged to my late father, I was surprised to discover that he was not merely a salaried employee of your syndicate, but a partner. As his heir, I believe I am entitled to his share of the capital, or at the very least, the interest on it. I find it quite astonishing that the syndicate has yet to acknowledge this fact. I must also mention that I uncovered some notes related to the syndicate's affairs that have caused me considerable anxiety and distress. However, I prefer not to detail them here in writing. I would appreciate the opportunity for a meeting with you to discuss both of these matters and determine what steps should be taken next. Perhaps you could meet me here, or I would be happy to travel to London if that's more convenient for you. Yours faithfully, Madeleine COBURN. Madeleine grimaced as she read the letter aloud. "Oh, how could I possibly do that? I haven't found any notes, and besides, it would be terrible to act as bait." "There's something even more pressing," Bostick interjected, his tone sharp. "Do you realize, Mr. Inspector, that if Miss Slatton sends that letter, she could be putting herself in serious danger?" "Not at all," Trammell replied calmly. "You haven't heard my full plan. When Beamish receives that letter, he will likely present it to Archer, and they will probably conclude that they need to figure out what Miss Slatton knows and calm her concerns about the money. They may say, 'We didn't believe she was that sort, but it's clear she's out for whatever benefit she can gain. Let's offer her 1,000 or 2 each year as interest on her father's supposed share. To us, it will be a small amount, but it will seem substantial to her, and it will give us some leverage to keep her quiet if she knows anything. Then Beamish will ask Miss Slatton to meet with him, likely in London. She won't go alone. She'll bring a close friend, Perhaps you, Mr. Bostick, since you were at the clearing and have some knowledge of the situation. You'll be prepared, and I'll have a couple of men from the yard on standby, perhaps disguised as waiters if we choose a restaurant for the meeting. At that meeting, Miss Slatton, you will present yourself in a new light. You'll put on a confident front. You'll confront Captain Beamish, claiming you know he's smuggling brandy and that the money he's offering isn't nearly enough. You'll demand £25,000 in cash for your father's share in the business, and you must make it seem like you were unaware of the ongoing arrangements. We will go into the details of the interview later, but it's crucial that Beamish realizes Mr. Bostick is involved in the entire affair. Upon receiving the £25,000, the incriminating notes will be handed over. You'll explain that, as a precaution, you've sent those notes in a sealed envelope to your solicitor, along with a detailed account of the entire situation, instructing him to open it that afternoon unless you personally reclaim it beforehand. Now, about your concerns, Miss Slatton. I fully understand how unpleasant this task will be for you. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't suggest it. However, the individuals we're dealing with did not hesitate to lure your father into a cab, intending to kill him. They did this under the guise of friendship, exploiting the trust he placed in them, and they approached the act with cold deliberation. You shouldn't let your feelings hold you back from doing what I suggest to ensure justice for your father's memory. Madeleine steadied herself. I know you're right, and if there's no other option, I won't hesitate, she replied, though a look of anguish lingered in her eyes. Will you help me, Marlon? She looked at her companion with hope. Bostick hesitated, arguing that despite all of Trammell's precautions, the girl would still be at risk, but she refused to entertain that line of thought. Eventually, he relented. With his assistance, Madeleine rewrote the letter in her own words and addressed it to Captain Beamish, C.O. Messrs. The Land's Pit-Prop Syndicate, Selden, Hull. After ensuring that he would be notified immediately by phone when a reply came, Trammell left the house and was driven back to Brighton. The next morning, he returned to London. He believed the Girondin would arrive in Selden the following Friday, so he returned to Hull on Thursday. He wanted to keep his distance from Hunt, anticipating that the latter's business dealings would be too well publicized by that point. Therefore, he chose a different hotel, calling the excise officer to arrange a meeting for that evening. Hunt arrived around 9, and the two men retreated to Trammell's bedroom, where the inspector recounted his activities in Bordeaux. Then Hunt shared what he uncovered since their last meeting. I finally have everything I need, he said. You remember we both noticed those 5 houses taking in far more brandy than they could ever sell. Well, I've discovered how they're offloading the excess. Trammell raised an eyebrow in inquiry. They're selling it to other houses. They've got 3 men dedicated solely to this task. They go in and buy anything from a single bottle to 3 or 4 kegs, and there's always a reliable reason for the purchase. Usually, it's that they're acting on behalf of a publican whose stock has just run out and needs a quick refill. But the fact remains that all the purchases are completely legitimate. They are made openly, and the full price is paid without question. However, upon further investigation, I found that there's a hidden rebate. A small percentage of the cost is refunded. This compensates everyone involved and keeps things under wraps. Trammell nodded in understanding. It's all very well organized, he said. They truly deserve to succeed. Yes, but they won't, came the reply. Unfortunately, my findings won't help you. I'm convinced that none of these individuals know anything about the main conspiracy. The next morning, Trammell was back at it again. Just before dawn broke, he drove from the city to the end of Selden Lane. 10 minutes after parking his car, he found himself in the dilapidated cottage. There, he dug out his telephone from the box where he had hidden it and took his usual position at the window, ready to listen to any messages that might come through. His watch was longer than before, and it wasn't until nearly 4 o'clock that he saw Archer lock his office door and head toward the filing room. Almost immediately, he heard Benson's voice call out, "Are you there?" They chatted for a few minutes as before. The Girondin, it turned out, had arrived hours earlier with a load of $13.75. It was clear that the members of the syndicate had agreed never to use the term gallons. Trammell figured this was a sensible precaution against eavesdroppers, and he mused that both he and Gibbons would have unraveled the true nature of the conspiracy much sooner if they hadn't been so careful. Eventually, they arrived at the topic Trammell was eager to hear about. Beamish, the manager, explained that he was present and wanted to speak with Archer. "That you, Archer?" came a voice Trammell recognized as the captain. "I just received a rather troubling message from Madeleine Slatten. She's asking for Slatten's share of the deal and seems to have knowledge of what we're actually up to. It sounds like someone put her up to it, probably that fellow Bostick." "Just give me a moment, and I'll read it to you," he said. Then he began to read Madeleine's letter. Archer's response was brief yet intense, and despite the seriousness of the situation, Trammell couldn't help but smile. After a short silence, Archer asked, "When did you receive that?" "Just now, when we arrived, but Benson mentioned it's been waiting for me for 3 days." "You should read it again." Beamish did just that, and soon Archer continued, "I believe there's no need for excessive worry. She might know something, but I suspect it's just as you said. Bostick is trying to make her bluff. It requires some thought. I have an appointment shortly, and regardless, we can't discuss this properly over the phone. We need to meet. Can you come to my house tonight?" "Yes, if you think it's a good idea." "It's not particularly wise, but I think we have to take the chance. You're not known here, but come alone. It's better if Benson doesn't get involved." "Understood. What time?" "How about 9? I often work late, and I won't be interrupted. Just come to my study window, and I'll be there. Knock softly. The window is on the right side of the house as you approach the drive, the fourth one from the corner. You can sneak around to it in the shadows of the bushes and stay on the grass the whole time." "Okay, 9 o'clock then." The phone clicked off, and soon after, Trammell saw Archer reappear in his office. The inspector felt a wave of disappointment. He had hoped the conspirators would hash out their plans over the phone so he could simply listen in. Now, it dawned on him that if he wanted the information he needed, it would require considerably more effort, and possibly danger. He knew he had to find a way to be present during that meeting in Archer's study, but the more he pondered it, the more challenging it seemed. He had no idea about the layout of the house or whether there were any hiding spots in the study. He couldn't think of any way to get inside. Time was not on his side, as he couldn't leave his hiding place until it grew dark, around 6 o'clock. He realized that this would be one of the toughest challenges he'd ever faced. Yet, he knew he had to figure it out, so when night fell, he slipped out of the cottage and walked the mile to Archer's home. It was a large, square house, approached by a winding drive flanked by rhododendron bushes. The front porch was inviting, and there were lights glowing in a cluster of windows to the left, most likely the dining room, he guessed. He followed Beamish's directions and made his way around to the right, staying hidden in the shadows of the shrubs. The third and fourth windows along the right side were also lit, and he crept up quietly to peek over the sill. The blinds were down, but the one on the third window wasn't quite fully closed, leaving a narrow gap. Through this sliver, he could see into the room. It was empty for the moment, but the warmth of a cheerful fire flickered in the grate. The room was set up as a study, filled with signs of wealth and refinement. By shifting his view from one end of the gap to the other, he could see nearly all of the floor and more than half of the walls. However, in that limited view, he spotted no place to hide, assuming he could manage to get inside. But was entry even possible? He examined the window sashes. They were made of steel, hinged to open inward like French doors, secured by a handle that couldn't be turned from the outside. If the sashes had been the usual English type secured with simple locks, he would have had the window open in no time. But with these, he found himself at a loss. He walked around the house, checking the other windows. Each was fitted with the same kind of sash, and like the others, they were all secured. The front door was shut as well, and though he might have used his bent wire to open it, he sensed that stepping into the hall without knowing what lay inside would be too risky. Once again, he was hindered by the fact that if he were discovered, it would ruin everything he was working toward. After circling the building, he looked through the study window again and saw immediately that his chance had slipped away. Archer was seated at the large desk, busily writing. Various ideas for gaining entry flashed through his mind, but he quickly dismissed each one as unfeasible. Unless something unexpected happened that he could use to his advantage, he began to worry that he would not be able to carry out his plan. By then, it was already 8:30, and he stepped back from the window, finding refuge behind a nearby shrub. He didn't want Beamish to spot him if the man arrived early for their meeting. It felt like an eternity, but after more than half an hour, a shadowy figure appeared dimly in the faint light filtering through the study blinds. Approached the window and tapped lightly on the glass. Almost immediately the blind went up, the sash opened, the figure slipped inside, the sash closed softly, and the blind was pulled down once more. In just 3 seconds, Trammell was back at the sill. The gap under the blind remained, since the other window had been opened. He first checked to see if he could pry open this window enough to hear the conversation, but was disappointed to find it securely shut. So he settled for observing through the opening. He watched as the two men settled down on either side of the fire and lit their cigars. Beamish handed the other man a piece of paper, presumably Madeleine's letter. After Archer read it twice, a discussion started. At first, it appeared that Archer was making an important point, judging by the other man's rapt attention and his gestures of excitement and concern. But not a word of their conversation reached the inspector's ears. He remained there for nearly 2 hours, growing increasingly cramped from his crouched position and chilled by the biting autumn air. Throughout that time the men spoke earnestly, and shortly after 11 they rose and moved toward the window. Trammell quickly ducked behind his bush. The window opened quietly, and Beamish stepped out onto the grass, the light illuminating his strong, somewhat severe face. Archer leaned out after him, and Trammell heard him say in a hushed tone, "So you'll speak up at 11." To which the other nodded before silently retreating. The window closed, the blind was drawn, and all fell silent. Trammell waited a few moments to ensure the captain had moved on, then he left his hiding spot, and keeping to the grass, made his way down the drive and out onto the road. He felt profoundly disappointed. He had not achieved his goal, and the only glimmer of hope in the immediate future was Archer's last remark. If it meant what he suspected, that the men were to communicate through the secret telephone at 11 in the morning, then all might not be lost. He might find out what he had missed that night. It hardly seemed worthwhile to return to Hull, so he went to the Raven Bar in Selden, knocked on the landlord's door, and after paying several times the usual price, managed to get a meal and some provisions for the next day. Then he returned to the empty cottage, let himself in, closed the door behind him, and lying down on the floor with his head on his arm, drifted off to sleep. The next morning found him back at his post by the broken window, the telephone receiver pressed to his ear. His guess about the meaning of Archer's remark at the study window turned out to be right, because at exactly 11 he heard the familiar call. "Are you there?" That signaled the start of a conversation. Beamish's voice continued. "I've discussed this matter with Benson, and he's made a suggestion that I believe improves our plan. He thinks we should hold our general meeting in London right after I talk with Madeleine Slatten. The benefit of this approach is that if we discover she has truly significant information, we could quickly decide our next steps, and I could, if needed, meet with her again that very night. Benson suggests I arrange to meet her around 10:30 or 11, then I can join you for lunch at 1:30, after which we can discuss my report, and I could see her once more around 4 or 5 o'clock. It seems like a solid plan. What do you think?" "It has its merits," Archer replied thoughtfully. "If you both believe it's best, I'm completely on board. Where should we hold the meetings?" "For Miss Slatten, we won't change our arrangement from last night. A private sitting room at the Gresham will still work perfectly. If you're heading to town, you could find a venue for our meeting, ideally somewhere nearby." "Sounds good. I'll be going up on Tuesday anyway, so I'll sort something out. I'll inform Benson, and he can pass the word to you and the others. I think we should travel by separate trains. I'll probably take the 5:03 from Hull the night before. When will you be back in town?" "Monday week, around midday, I expect. Benson could go up that morning, and Buller and I can take the 4 o'clock train separately, while Fox, Henry, and Raymond, if he joins us, can catch the first train the following morning. How does that sound? That works for me. The meetings will take place on Tuesday at 11 a.m. and 1:30 p.m., with Benson providing the address for the second. We can discuss returning to Hull during the meeting. Got it, Beamish replied tersely, and that marked the end of their conversation. For once, Trammell felt a surge of optimism from what he had overheard. His failure the night before wasn't going to be as serious as he had feared. Despite it all, he had learned the conspirators' plans and couldn't help but grin at how effectively his scheme was unfolding, drawing the gang right into the trap he had set. From his perspective, he held all the cards in this situation, and if he played them wisely, he would not only capture the men, but also secure the evidence needed to convict them. To find out where the syndicate was meeting, he would need to follow Archer into town and keep an eye on him as he went about his business. It was Saturday, and the managing director had mentioned he was heading to town the following Tuesday. That left him a week until the meeting, plenty of time to make the necessary arrangements. Trammell stayed in the cottage until dark that evening, then made his way to Selden Station and returned to Hull. The first thing he did upon reaching the city was send a letter to Madeleine, asking her to forward Beamish's response to him at the yard. On Monday, he began tailing Archer, just in case he decided to go to town that day. However, the distiller made no move until Tuesday, catching the 6:15 train from Hull that morning. By 12:25 they arrived at King's Cross. Archer casually exited the train, crossed the platform, hopped into a taxi, and drove off. Trammell, taking a second taxi, followed about 50 yards behind. Their pursuit led westward along the Euston Road, and when they turned left onto Gower Street, the lead taxi came to a stop at the Gresham Hotel on Bedford Square. Trammell's taxi passed by the other cab, and through the soft glow of the evening light, the inspector spotted Archer stepping out and heading into the hotel. He pulled over to a stop on Bloomsbury Street and waited. About 5 minutes later, Archer emerged once more, got back into his taxi, and the driver headed south. Trammell's car slid in behind, and the pursuit began anew. They crossed Oxford Street, then made their way down Charing Cross Road, finally stopping at a small foreign restaurant tucked away in a narrow lane off Cranbourne Street. Trammell's taxi mimicked its earlier tactic, parking opposite a shop where he could catch sight of the other vehicle through the glow of the lights. He thought he had gathered enough information, but there was still a chance that Archer might not find a table at that restaurant and would need to look elsewhere. This time Archer lingered longer. 15 minutes passed before he finally emerged and climbed back into his taxi. The chase was brief this time. At the Trocadero, Archer stepped out, paid his driver, and entered the building. Trammell, keeping a low profile, managed to see him settle at a table and casually glance over the menu. Convinced that Archer would be there for at least another half-hour, the inspector quietly slipped out and hopped back into his taxi, which took him to the restaurant off Cranbourne Street. Once there, he requested to speak to the manager and pulled him aside. "I'm Inspector Trammell from Scotland Yard," he said sharply, a tone that was much more serious than his usual relaxed manner. "Listen closely." He displayed his credentials, and the manager bowed with exaggerated respect. "I'm tracking that gentleman who just inquired about a room a moment ago. I need to know what he discussed with you." The manager, a sly and unsavory-looking man of apparent Eastern descent, began to evade the question, but Trammell interrupted him without hesitation. "Now listen here," he said bluntly. "I don't have time to waste with you. The man you were speaking to is wanted for murder, and now you must decide whether to cooperate with the police or oppose them. If you cause us any trouble, you could find yourself in the dark as an accessory after the fact. In any case, it's unwise for someone in your position to cross paths with law enforcement." His threat had more impact than it likely would have with an Englishman in a similar situation, and the manager became eager to help. Yes, the gentleman had inquired about a room. He had ordered lunch in a private room for a party of 7 at 1:30 the following Tuesday. He had been quite specific about the room, insisting on inspecting it first, and he had approved of it. Apparently, the party had some business to discuss after lunch, and the gentleman had requested assurance that they would not be disturbed. He introduced himself as Mr. Hodgson. They had agreed on a price. Trammell then insisted on seeing the room for himself, and was led upstairs to a small, rather dim chamber. It contained a decent-sized oval table surrounded by red plush chairs, with a red plush sofa along one side and a narrow sideboard along the other. The walls were adorned with cheap, worn decorations, featuring beveled mirrors and faded gold trim. Two large yet entirely mediocre oil paintings hung above the fireplace and the sideboard, respectively, and the window was covered with gelatin paper made to resemble stained glass. Inspector Trammell surveyed the room, his brow furrowed. How on earth was he supposed to conceal himself in this sparsely furnished space? There was no room beneath the sofa, and even less under the sideboard. There were no adjoining rooms or cupboards where he could hide, listening intently at the keyhole. It felt to him like he was simply facing one unsolvable problem after another. He recalled the conversation in Archer's study with a sense of regret, realizing that, no matter the cost in time and effort, he couldn't allow such a debacle to happen again. He stood in silence, contemplating the issue while the manager hovered nearby, bowing and wringing his hands nervously. Suddenly, an idea sparked in his mind. He walked over to the wall behind the sideboard and hit it firmly. It echoed with a hollow sound. "A partition?" he asked. "What's behind it?" "Another room, sir. A private room just like this one," the manager replied. "Show it to me." The other room was smaller, but otherwise similar to the one they had just left. The doors of both rooms stood side by side, leading to the same hallway. "This will work," Trammell said decisively. "Now listen, Mr. Manager, I need to overhear the conversations of your customers, and I might decide to make some arrests. You will bring them up and serve them lunch just as you planned. Some officers from the yard and I will hide ourselves in here beforehand. Understand?" The manager nodded vigorously. "Meanwhile, I'll send a carpenter to make a hole in that partition between the two rooms, about 2 feet by 1, behind the upper part of that picture above the sideboard. Do you get that?" The manager was wringing his hands even tighter. "Oh dear," he exclaimed, "but my rooms, they will be destroyed." "Your rooms will be just fine," Trammell assured him. "I'll cover any damages, and I'll pay you handsomely for everything. You won't lose out if you play fair, but if not—" he fixed the manager with a hard stare. "If the slightest hint of my plan reaches any of the men, it will be 10 years at least." "It shall be done. Everything will happen as you say," the manager promised. "It better," Trammell replied sternly, and with a determined look, he left the restaurant. "The Gresham Hotel," he instructed his driver as he climbed back into his taxi. His demeanor toward the manager of the Bedford Square Hotel was markedly different from how he treated the German. Introducing himself as an inspector from the yard, he asked about Archer's visit. Without missing a beat, she provided the details. The distiller had booked a private sitting room for a business meeting scheduled for 11 o'clock the following Tuesday with a Miss Slatton, a Mr. Bostick, and a Captain Beamish. So far, so good, Trammell thought gleefully as he drove away. They're walking right into the trap. I'll have them all. I'll have them within a week. At the yard, he dismissed his taxi, and upon entering his room, he discovered the letter he had been anticipating from Madeleine. It included one from Beamish, which read, F-E-R-R-I-B-Y, Y-O-R-K-S. Saturday. Dear Miss Carburn, I have just received your letter dated the 25th, and I am quick to respond. I am truly saddened to hear that you feel mistreated by the members of the syndicate. I can assure you that any obligations they may have incurred will be settled promptly and honorably. It is, however, news to me that your late father was a partner. I had always believed he held his position, much like I do mine, as a salaried employee who receives a bonus based on the company's profits. As for the notes you've come across regarding the syndicate's operations, it's clear these can be easily explained, as there was nothing complicated or difficult in the way we conducted our business. I would be happy to meet and discuss the issues you raised. and I suggest we convene at 11 a.m. on Tuesday, the 10th of next month, at the Gresham Hotel in Bedford Square, if that suits you. With kind regards. Yours sincerely, WALTR Beamish. Trammell smiled as he read the letter. The wording was quite clever, leaving the option open for any actions the syndicate might take. Ah, my friend, he thought grimly, you're in for a surprise on Tuesday. You'll see that Miss Slatton isn't as easy to catch as you believe. Just wait and see. For the next few days, Trammell focused on preparing for his big move. First, he travelled back to Eastbourne via Brighton to coach Madeleine and Bostick on their roles for the upcoming meeting. Then, he supervised the construction of a hole in the wall dividing the 2 private rooms at the Cranbourne Street restaurant and trained the group of men who would be waiting in the annex. To his immense satisfaction, he discovered that every word spoken at the table in the larger room was perfectly audible to anyone standing by the opening next door. He also assigned 2 trusted men to be on standby near the private room at the Gresham during the meeting between Madeleine and Beamish. With all his plans in London set, he returned to Hull and started using the secret telephone to keep tabs on the activities of the syndicate. Chapter 20. Inspector Trammell spent the Saturday before that decisive Tuesday at the telephone in the empty cottage. Nothing noteworthy came through the wire, except that Benson informed Trammell he had received a telegram from Beamish, saying that, in order to reach Selden at the agreed time, he needed to set sail without a full load of props. The 2 men went over the various trains they and their associates would take to London. Both pieces of news pleased Trammell, as they confirmed that the original plans were still in effect. By Monday morning, as the crucial moment of his operation drew near, he felt restless and even anxious, at least as anxious as an inspector of the yard on duty could be. So much relied on the outcome of the next day and a half. His own future was uncertain, as were the fates of the men he was up against. Miss Slatton and Bostick would also be deeply affected by how things turned out. His success would carry weight not just within his department, but for the nation as a whole. He decided he would, if possible, witness the various members of the gang as they set out, travelling himself by train with Archer, the leader and the man most urgently sought. He recalled that Benson was to go first. With this in mind, Trammell lingered at the Paragon station, observing the departing trains, and felt satisfied when he saw Benson board the 9:10 a.m. with a few words and a couple of shillings. He persuaded an official to check the traveller's ticket, which turned out to be a 3rd-class return to King's Cross. Beamish and Buller were scheduled to travel by the 4 p.m. train, and Trammell, cleverly disguised as a deep-sea fisherman, watched them arrive separately, purchase their tickets, and get on board. Beamish travelled first, followed by Buller, and once again the inspector had their tickets checked, confirming they were headed to London. Archer was set to leave at 5:30, and Trammell planned to accompany him as a precaution, keeping a close watch. Still dressed in his fisherman disguise, he purchased his ticket, boarded the rear of the train, and kept an eye on the platform until he spotted Archer, suitcase and rug in hand. Cautiously peering out, he saw Archer climb aboard the coach headed for King's Cross. As the train passed the depot at Selden, Trammell noticed that the Girondin was not unloading pit props as expected. Instead, it was loading casks of some sort. He remembered from the previous Friday, when he had been in the area, that some wagons carrying these casks had been moved inside the enclosure and were being unloaded by men from the syndicate. The casks resembled those used for transporting crude oil for the ship's diesel engines, and the fact that they were being loaded without having been emptied suggested that the pumping plant at the wharf was malfunctioning. The train departed from Goole and continued on to Doncaster, where the carriage would connect to one of the major expresses heading north. Out of habit, Trammell leaned out of the window at Goole to see if anyone would leave Archer's carriage, but no one did. Arriving at Doncaster, Trammell received an unexpected jolt. As his train pulled into the station, another was leaving, and he casually scanned the line of coaches. A figure in the corner of a 3rd-class compartment caught his eye, someone who looked oddly familiar. Before he could process it, the figure was out of sight, and he realized that it reminded him of Benson. Having not seen the man's face clearly, he quickly dismissed the thought, shrugging it off with the notion that everyone has a double. Moments later, the train came to a stop at the platform. He leaned out again, and soon spotted Archer getting off the train. It was clear he was leaving his suitcase and rugged behind to keep his seat as he slowly made his way down the platform. This wasn't unusual, as there were often 17 minutes between the arrival of the train from Hull and the departure of the one to London, and passengers commonly stepped out of their carriages while they were being shunted. Trammell discreetly followed, and shortly saw Archer disappear into the first-class refreshment room. He positioned himself where he could see the door and waited for Archer to come back, but the distiller showed no signs of hurrying. 10 minutes passed, and still there was no sign of him. The express from the north roared in, the engine was uncoupled, and the shunting began. The train was scheduled to leave at 6:22, and now the large clock showed 6:19. Trammell started to feel anxious. Had he lost him? At 6:20 he could bear it no longer, and despite the risk of running into Archer the moment he decided to leave the refreshment room, he pushed open the door and peeked inside. He exhaled in relief. Archer was sitting at a table, sipping what appeared to be a whiskey and soda. As Trammell watched, Archer glanced up at the clock, now showing 6:21, and settled into his chair more comfortably. Was he really going to miss the train? Trammell felt a pang of disappointment, and had the urge to rush over and remind him of the departure time. But he composed himself, slipped back to his watching post, and resumed his vigil. Moments later, the train whistled and gracefully pulled out of the station. Trammell waited for another 15 minutes, then saw the distiller finally exit the refreshment room and walk slowly down the platform. As Trammell followed, it became clear that Archer had intentionally let the train leave without him, though Trammell could fathom why. He made his way to the ticket office and seemed to purchase a ticket before turning to walk back down the platform. Trammell stepped into a doorway to stay hidden until the man passed, then hurried to the booking window. He introduced himself and asked where the last passenger had booked his ticket. The clerk replied, "Selby," which left Trammell feeling frustrated and utterly baffled. What on earth was Archer planning? He bought a timetable and began examining the options. First, he familiarized himself with the layout. The main line of the East Coast route, running from London to Scotland, travelled almost directly north and south through Doncaster. 18 miles to the north lay Selby, the next major station. At Selby, a line ran east and west, leading one way to Leeds and the other to Hull. About halfway between Selby and Hull, at a junction called Staddlethorpe, another line branched off and curved southwest to Goole, and then on to Doncaster. Thus, Selby, Staddlethorpe, and Doncaster formed a triangle, with one side extending towards Hull. This arrangement meant that travellers to and from Hull had two connections to the main line, either directly to Selby or via Goole to Doncaster. Trammell began to study the train schedule. The first train heading north was the 4 p.m. dining car express from King's Cross to Newcastle. It departed Doncaster at 7:56 and arrived in Selby at 8:21. Would Archer take that train? And if he did, what would be his next step? For nearly an hour, Trammell sat curled up in a corner seat, keeping an eye on Archer in the distance while his mind wrestled with the mystery. He strained his thoughts for almost an hour without any breakthrough, when suddenly a shocking realization hit him, leaving him frozen with distress. For a moment, he couldn't bring himself to accept such a disastrous possibility. But as he continued to think it over, he noticed that one puzzling and seemingly unrelated fact after another was taking on a new meaning. Everything he considered suddenly clicked into place, forming a coherent picture. He understood now why Archer couldn't discuss Madeleine's letter over the phone, but was able to set up the meeting with Beamish that way. He remembered Archer standing at his study window, mentioning a call at 11 the next morning. He realized that Benson's amendment was likely arranged by Archer the night before. He grasped why the Girondin had left Lesk without her full load, and why she was at Selden loading barrels. He recognized the person he had seen passing in the other train when his had just reached Doncaster, and he understood Archer's visit to Selby. In short, he saw he had been deceived, tricked, meticulously, systematically, and at every turn. While he had been patting himself on the back for how completely the conspirators seemed to be falling into his trap, he had, in fact, walked right into theirs. He felt like a child in their hands. They had clearly monitored his every move and countered him at each step. He realized now that his tapping of the secret telephone had likely been discovered, and his adversaries had used this knowledge to throw him off track. They must have understood that Madeleine's letter was inspired by him and interpreted his motives for having her send it. They had then used the phone to make him think they were slipping into his trap, while their real plans were being finalized in Archer's study. He believed he now understood what those plans were. There would be no meetings in London the following day. Those meetings were meant to draw him, Trammell, to the city and keep him there. By tomorrow, the gang, convinced they were about to be discovered, would be on the Girondin and sailing away. They were, as he thought to himself, making a run for it. So it was necessary for the Girondin to load up with barreled oil to head for a country where Scotland Yard detectives didn't roam, and where extradition laws held little weight. Thus, she would need to return light, or, as he suspected, nearly empty, since there wouldn't be time to unload. Furthermore, he needed to provide a good reason for this lightness, lest anyone notice the ship riding high in the water and become suspicious. He now realized it had actually been Benson he saw returning to Selden via Goole, and that Archer was making the same trip through Selby. He checked the train schedules from Selby to Selden. There was only one train, leaving Selby at 9:19, arriving just 58 minutes after the Doncaster train had reached it, and getting to Selden at 10:07. It was approaching 8 o'clock now, giving him nearly 2.5 hours to set his plans in motion. Although Trammell tended to be a bit slow to think, he was quick to act. Confident that Archer would catch the 7:56 to Selby, he relaxed his watch and went to the telephone call office. There, he contacted the police station in Selby, requesting a plainclothes officer and 2 constables to meet him at the train for an arrest. He also asked for a fast car to be on standby to take him directly to Selden. After that, he called the police in Hull and had an extended conversation with the superintendent. In the end, they arranged for a sergeant and 12 officers to wait for him on the shore behind the signal cabin near the Selden depot, equipped with a boat and a grappling ladder to board the Girondin. With everything in place, Trammell hurried back to the platform, arriving just as the 7:56 train pulled in. He observed Archer board the train, and then entered a different compartment himself. Once in Selby, his target disembarked and walked along the platform towards the booking office. Trammell's police training helped him spot the plainclothes officer immediately, and he instructed him to follow Archer and find out which station he planned to book. In a few moments, the man returned and said it was Selden. Calling over the 2 constables, the 4 officers followed the distiller into the first-class waiting room where he had taken refuge. Trammell approached him. "Archibald Charles Archer," he declared, his voice stern. "I am Inspector Trammell from Scotland Yard. I have a warrant for your arrest on the charge of murdering Francis Slatton in a cab in London on September 12. You should know that anything you say can be used as evidence against you." For a moment, the distiller seemed so stunned by the revelation that he could hardly move, and before he could regain his composure, there was a click as handcuffs fastened around his wrists. His expression shifted to one of rage, and with a primal roar, he lunged at Trammell, trying to grab him by the throat despite being restrained. But the struggle was short-lived. The other 3 men quickly pulled him away, leaving him glaring at Trammell while hurling furious curses. "Keep an eye on him, Sergeant," Trammell said, a bit out of breath as he attempted to fix his dishevelled tie. "I need to move on to Selden." A powerful car was waiting outside the station. Trammell jumped in and offered the driver an extra £1 if he could reach Selden within 50 minutes. He estimated the distance at about 25 miles and figured he could maintain an average speed of 30 miles an hour. The night was pitch black as the large vehicle pulled out of Selby, heading east. A slight wind blew in from the east, carrying a damp chill that felt worse than frost. Trammell, having left his coat on the London train, shivered as he wrapped the only blanket the car provided around his shoulders. The road to Howden was wide and smooth, and the car glided along. But once they reached Howden, the main road turned north, and they had to slow down on the lesser cross roads leading to Selden. Trammell felt satisfied with their progress when at 9:38, 54 minutes after departing from Selby, they arrived at Selden Lane, close to the distillery and directly across from the railway signal cabin. After making arrangements with the driver to head up to the main road and wait for 4 blasts on the Girondin's horn before proceeding to the syndicate's depot, the inspector dismounted. He pushed through the railway fence, crossed the tracks, and descended the low embankment toward the river. Just as he reached the shore, he spotted a dim figure emerging from the darkness. "Who's there?" Trammell asked softly. "Constable Jones, sir," came the response. "Is that Inspector Trammell? Sergeant Hobbs is here with the boats." Trammell followed Jones for about 50 yards along the beach until they reached 2 boats, each carrying a half-dozen policemen. The night was still dark, and the wind was cold and biting. The only sound came from the waves lapping against the shingle. Trammell sensed that the night was perfect for their mission. The noise from the wind and water would conceal any sounds the men made as they boarded the Girondin, yet it wouldn't drown out any conversation occurring nearby. "We just arrived, sir," the sergeant said. "I hope we didn't keep you waiting." "I just got here myself," Trammell replied. "You brought 12 men." "Yes, sir." "Are they armed?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I trust you all know not to fire unless absolutely necessary. What's your plan for boarding?" "We have a ladder with hooks at the top to catch onto the taffrail." "Have you muffled your oars?" "Yes, sir." "Very well. Now listen carefully and make sure you understand what to do. When we reach the ship, get the ladder in place, and I'll go up first. You and the men will follow. Stay close, Sergeant. We'll listen in as much as we can. When I give the signal, charge in and arrest everyone involved." "Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Then let's get started." They pushed off, gliding silently over the dark water. The ship carried a riding light that guided their path. Trammell knew she was positioned with her bow facing upstream. The tide was strong, and as they neared the ship, they stopped rowing and let the current bring them to her stern. The leading boat slipped beneath her counter, and the bowman secured the painter to her rudder post. The second boat tied its painter to the stern of the first, and the current pulled both alongside. The men, careful not to make a sound, eased their boats into place. The ladder was raised and hooked in, and Trammell quietly climbed up, cautiously lifting his head above the taffrail. The port side of the ship was once again shrouded in darkness, prompting Trammell to tug the ladder as a signal for the others to follow. In moments, all 14 men stood like shadows on the lower deck. Then Trammell crept forward and began ascending the ladder to the bridge deck, just as Gibbons had done about 4 months earlier. Like that occasion, the starboard side of the ship, facing the wharf, was dimly lit. A light glowed from the captain's cabin, accompanied by the murmur of voices. Trammell placed his men in 2 groups at either end of the cabin, ready to rush around in opposite directions when he gave the signal and reached the door. Then he and the sergeant moved forward and pressed their ears to the window. This time, although the glass was propped open like before, the curtain was fully drawn across the opening, preventing them from seeing much and only allowing them to catch snippets of the conversation. Trammell carefully reached in and slowly pulled the curtain back just a bit. Fortunately, no one seemed to notice, and the discussion carried on without interruption. The inspector could now see inside. 5 men were crowded around the small table. Beamish and Buller sat on one side, directly facing him, with Fox at the end. The 2 remaining men had their backs to the window, and the inspector suspected they were Raymond and Henry. Each had a tall glass of whiskey and soda in front of them, and a box of cigars was open on the table. They appeared anxious and jittery, as if under tremendous pressure, constantly fidgeting and checking their watches. Their conversation seemed strained, as if forced to keep from falling apart. Raymond spoke up. "And you saw him leave?" he asked. "Yes," Fox replied. He slipped out quietly and looked around. "At the time, I didn't know who he was, but I realized no one should be at the cottage at that hour, so I followed him to Selden Station. I caught a glimpse of his face in the light there. And you recognized him? No, but I remembered he had been with that excise inspector, and I suspected he was onto something. Oui, yes, the Frenchman pressed. Well, naturally, I reported it to the chief. He knew who it was. Bien, there are no, how do you say, fools with Archer, right? And then? The chief figured it out from the captain's description. Fox nodded toward Beamish. You've met him, right, Captain? He bought me a drink, the big man replied, but I don't know why. But how did he find out about the telephone? Buller asked, his voice deep and rumbling. Can't figure it out, Fox said, but it indicates he was aware of everything going on. Then there was that letter from Miss Slatton. It gave everything away because there couldn't have been any papers like she claimed, and she couldn't have uncovered anything she didn't know back at the clearing. Archer had Morton look into it, and he discovered that this Trammell went down to Eastbourne one night just a couple of days before the letter arrived. So that lined everything up. Then he had me keep an eye out for him at the telephone, and he completely outsmarted him. I suppose he's in London now, making arrangements to arrest us all tomorrow. Buller let out a hearty chuckle. As you say, he nodded at Raymond. Archer's sharp, isn't he? I've always admired Archer, Beamish said, but I never thought as highly of him as I did that night we drew lots to decide who would take care of Slatton. When he drew the short straw, he didn't even flinch. That was the last time we had a full meeting, and we certainly didn't expect this to be the next. At that moment, a train rumbled past on its way to Hull. There's his train, Fox shouted. He should be here any minute. How long does it take to get here from the station? Raymond asked. About 15 minutes, Captain Beamish replied. We have plenty of time to make our move. The men's nerves began to show more and more, but the conversation dragged on for nearly another 30 minutes. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps approached from the wharf. A man dashed across the gangway and raced up the ladder to the captain's cabin. The others leapt to their feet as the door swung open and Benson rushed in. He hasn't come, he exclaimed, his voice filled with urgency. I watched at the station, and he never got off. Panic spread across every face in the room, and Beamish cursed under his breath. Conversations erupted, filled with questions and theories. There are no other trains. Just the express. It doesn't stop here, but it makes a stop at Hassel if the guard is notified. He might have missed his connection at Selby, Fox suggested. In that case, he'd take a car. Beamish took charge. Benson, I need you to call the Central and find out if there's been any message. Trammell leaned in close to the sergeant, who nodded to two of his men. They hurried down the port ladder to the lower deck. A moment later, Benson followed along the starboard side, which was lit. Trammell listened intently, expecting what came next. A sudden scuffle, a muffled cry, a sharp click, and then silence. He peered through the porthole. Fox was passionately explaining his theory about the railway connections, and those inside were oblivious to the surrounding sounds. Soon, the sergeant returned with his men. I've got him tied up at the davit pole, he whispered to the inspector. He won't cause any trouble. Trammell nodded with satisfaction. That was 1 down out of 6, and he still had 14 men on his side. Meanwhile, the men in the cabin anxiously speculated about their leader's absence until, moments later, Beamish cursed under his breath. Blast that fool Benson, he muttered. What the devil is taking him so long? I'd better go and hurry him up. If they've captured Archer, we need to get out of here fast. Trammell grasped the sergeant's arm. Same plan again, but with 3 men, he hissed. The 4 had hardly disappeared down the port ladder when Beamish exited his cabin and started descending the starboard. Trammell sensed that the moment of crisis had arrived. He quietly instructed the remaining constables to gather around the cabin door, then reached for his revolver and steadied himself. Suddenly, a chaotic uproar erupted on the lower deck. Beamish shouted a warning that was quickly silenced, followed by the sound of running feet, a gunshot, and the noise of a fierce struggle. For a brief moment, silence enveloped the cabin as the men exchanged alarmed glances. Then Buller shouted, "Caught, by heavens!" and, surprisingly agile for a man his age, drew his revolver and charged out of the cabin. He was immediately tackled by 3 constables, and together they stumbled across the deck, Buller desperately trying to aim his weapon at his attackers. At that same moment, Trammell dashed to the door, raised his gun, and shouted, "Hands up, all of you! You're surrounded." Henry and Fox, closest to the door, raised their hands as if in a daze, but Raymond reacted quickly, his hand shooting out, and a bullet zipped past the inspector's head. Without hesitation, Trammell fired back, and with a scream, the Frenchman reeled backward. In just a few seconds, the remaining constables rushed in under the inspector's gun and handcuffed the 2 men inside the cabin. Trammell then turned to check on how things were going on deck, but those skirmishes were also finished. Both Beamish and Buller, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, had been captured. The inspector next inspected Raymond. His shot had been precise, with the bullet entering at the base of the man's right thumb and exiting through his wrist. While his life wasn't in danger, it would be quite a while before he would hold a revolver again. 4 blasts from the Girondin's horn summoned Trammell's car, and by the time the last group of prisoners was safely brought to the Hull police station 3 hours later, Trammell felt that the end of his efforts was finally within reach. The arrests provided the inspector with new leads to follow. Through his careful investigation of the prisoners' activities over the past 3 years, he pieced together the complete history of the Pit-Prop Syndicate, along with the details surrounding Slatten's murder. It appeared that the scheme originated with Raymond. He sought out a suitable English partner, chose Archer, discussed the plan with him, and found him eager to join. Soon, due to his commanding presence, Archer took the lead. They worked out the specifics, carefully selecting their accomplices. Beamish and Buller joined as partners, all 4 bound by their shared responsibilities. The remaining members were pawns whom the main group had some control over. In Slatten's case, Archer discovered the accounting discrepancies in time to turn the wayward cashier into his scapegoat. He addressed the deficit by securing a signed confession of guilt and an IOU for an amount that would have allowed the distiller to sell his business, destroying his home and future in the process. A partially erased address in a pocket diary belonging to Beamish led Trammell to a small shop on the south side of London, where he came across an assistant who had sold a piece of black serge to 2 men around the time of Slatten's murder. The salesperson remembered the sale because the customers had described what they wanted simply as cloth, which wasn't a proper term for any of the items he sold. The fabric found in the cab was identical to the one this man claimed to have used. Additionally, he recognized Beamish and Buller as the buyers. Trammell then conducted a thorough search of the restaurants in Soho and finally discovered the one where the conspirators had met before the murder. There had been 2 meetings. From the proprietor's description, Trammell learned that Slatten had attended the first meeting, but not the second. Despite his best efforts, he could not locate the shop where the pistol had been purchased, but he suspected that one of the other gang members had made the purchase to help distribute the blame for the crime. On the Girondin, they found a false bulkhead in Buller's cabin, hiding a concealed tank for brandy. The connection for the shore pipe was cleverly concealed behind the engineer's wash basin, which could be moved forward using a hidden spring. Also on the Girondin, they discovered more than £700,000, mostly in Brazilian notes. Benson later admitted that the plan had been to sink the Girondin off the coast of Bahia, escape in small boats, and row to shore under cover of night, intending to stay in Brazil until the commotion had settled. Instead, all 7 men received lengthy sentences. Archer faced the ultimate cost for his crimes, while the others were sentenced to 10 to 15 years each. The managers of the licensed establishments in Hull were believed to be unaware of the larger scheme and dealt privately and individually with Archer, allowing them and their accomplices to face lighter penalties. The enigmatic Morton turned out to be a private detective hired by Archer. He adamantly claimed he had no knowledge of the true nature of the syndicate's activities, and although the judge criticized his conduct harshly, there was no evidence against him, so he was never brought to trial. Inspector Trammell received the promotion he wanted from the case, but someone else gained even more. About a month after the trial, a wedding took place at Holy Trinity Church in Eastbourne. Marlon Bostick and Madeleine Slatten were joined in marriage. Gibbons, serving as best man, couldn't help but whisper to his friend as they left the vestry, 3 cheers for the Pit-Prop Syndicate. The end. The End. This concludes The Wine Merchant by Merle Chadwick, narrated by Mitchell Larson. Published by BrooksAudiobooks.com. All rights reserved. No portion of this audiobook may be reproduced in any form without written permission of the publisher. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks, and be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released.